Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully, I am actually being recorded. But in the meantime, welcome to my favorite part of the week where I record things for a class that isn't actually here and essentially talk to a camera. I hope you all enjoy it as much as I do. In the meantime, this week, as you might have guessed already, we're going to talk quite a bit about colonization and imperialism now that we've talked about the Industrial Revolution and how that helped prepare the world for and how it helped prepare Europe to be able to accomplish a lot of these things, and how colonization in turn benefited imperialism. Today, we're going to specifically focus on how this took place in the Middle East and Africa primarily, but also include a bit on Australia as well. As always, we'll start off by looking at some of the key terms. First, we're going to look at the term new imperialism. We'll look more in detail at colonialism. We'll look at James Cook and Australia's colonization. We'll look at the infamous Berlin Conference, and we'll look at the Entente Cordiale, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. My French has never been that fantastic. In the meantime as well, I of course want to make sure you're aware of all content quizzes coming up. If I remember correctly, this is actually a typo. You should be on content quiz 2 or 3. I've actually forgotten off the top of my head. Another problem again with these online classes. But either way, your next content quiz is due on October the 9th. It'll of course be due at 5 p.m. like everything else. It'll be located in the week folder, just like your other content quiz has been. Your midterm writing assignment is of course popping up on the 23rd. So you have most of the rest of this month to go ahead and start making sure you're prepared. I want to stress again, of course, that the prompt and the rubric are already on Moodle, so you can view those and make sure you know what all the expectations are well ahead of time. Finally, your second debate is popping up on October the 30th. Please also keep in mind that I've already shared out a sign-up sheet for potential times. Make sure you fill it out as soon as possible so we can actually have the debate, and everyone who puts in work to get ready for their debate notes is rewarded for that effort. In the meantime, let's jump straight into the thick of things. To understand anything we talk about over the next few days, you need to understand the idea of new imperialism. New imperialism is a period historians refer to where Europeans were for the first time conquering international territories with the express goal of setting up an empire. The colonization and imperialism, if you can call it that we referred to a little bit earlier, was essentially like what the Europeans would do in Africa. They would colonize and conquer a little bit. My apologies, I just heard a siren. I thought for some reason it was when my cat's dying. I got a little bit scared. But in the meantime, and I know, yes, I said more than one cat, don't judge me. But yeah, it was like what the Portuguese did, for example, in Africa, where they would set up trading posts essentially and just try to get resources. For the first time, now the Industrial Revolution is also underway, for example, these European countries feel they have the power and the resources to control entire countries directly. So again, what exactly is, based on that, what exactly is an empire and what sets it apart from things we talked about earlier? Alright, very good again, imaginary class that's hopefully viewing this in the future. That is just essentially what I mentioned earlier. Instead of just controlling small portions of territory or setting up outposts for trade, one country, like Great Britain for example, is taking over entire countries and in one form or another ruling them directly. So instead of just having access to some trade, you have access to everything. Colonialism is an offshoot of this, where these countries started to abandon the trade forts they'd set up, like I mentioned, and directly administered and controlled and exploited the economic and international economic resources of territories that they had conquered under new imperialism. Now, what were some of the benefits of colonialism and imperialism, especially, of course, for Europe? They're basically the ones benefiting from this. Yes, very good imaginary class once again. It essentially calls back to what I mentioned earlier. It was this imperialism and this colonialism that helped the Industrial Revolution really get off of its feet. There was some, of course, development in industry, as we've mentioned, before this started, but it was access to these huge amounts of resources and labor that really helped to get it set off. The hardships for the locals, of course, come back to that exploitation, which we'll talk about in more detail throughout the class today. One of the first instances of major imperialism and colonization occurred when the British essentially took over India. After the 7 Years' War, The British were allowed to set up trading posts in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta in India for the first time. Now, how does this again remind us of the international impact of the 7 Years' War? Think back to what happened to France, for example, once this war was over. All right, very good memory for some of you, I would hope. Yeah, it shows how after the French losses that they suffered during this war helped to grow the British Empire. Since the French were moved out of India, essentially, and the Spanish lost access to India, the British could now start setting up trading posts. Another important characteristic of this involvement in India was the rise of sepoys. These were European allied company armies that were used by regional Indian leaders to defeat their political rivals. So essentially, if one Indian prince didn't like another Indian prince living nearby, they could use one of these company allied armies to help fight them. Now, why would this benefit European colonization? Why are these random company armies going to help these Indians fight each other? For a hint, remember what happened with Cortez when he came to the Aztecs. Right, yes, very good, imaginary class. Thank you for remembering what we talked about with the Aztecs and early European colonization. Just like how Cortez used the division and rivalries in the Aztec Empire to take it over, British officials and British generals were able to use this division among Indian leaders in order to divide them as well. So if you help one prince take out another, you're be taking out some of your potential rivals and also putting that prince in debt to you. Basically turns everyone against each other and conquers new territory. Robert Clive, for example, was one of the most notorious at this. From 1725 to 1724, he existed on the earth. Weird way to phrase that, I know. But he eventually did become involved with some of these sepoys and the East India Company and helped defeat Indian and French allies at Plassey in 1757, which essentially established a monopoly for the British in all of India. Now, can anyone tell me what a monopoly is? Economics 101 here. I'll just stare awkwardly into the distance. I never know where to look during these pauses. But yes, very good, imaginary class. Since the British monopoly is where you have complete control over some kind of industry or some kind of business in an entire area. So, for example, as I think I've mentioned before, the Frontier Internet Company has a monopoly, essentially, over all internet providers in Western North Carolina near where I live. Therefore, we can't really get the internet from anyone else. As this example shows, monopolies are often a bad thing because once a business loses that has no more competition and has complete access to the market, they can essentially do whatever they want because you have no one else to turn to and no one else to buy from. Now that the British have no competition for their colonies and business in India, they can essentially do whatever they want and treat the locals however they want because the local Indians have no one else to turn to. Because of this, the British did start to have more control in India, which was first done indirectly. Now, why would the British want to rule indirectly in India, do you think, at first? But what might be some of the potential problems for them? Very good again, imaginary class. Of course, it might seem a bit less oppressive at first if you just sort of rule things economically and indirectly and don't try to come in and take everything over by force. However, you might also argue that it lets a little bit too much freedom to set up an empire, which can encourage rebellion. We'll see a bit of an example of both of those things in the next few minutes. One of the class of people that arose during this time period was known as nabobs. These were essentially British magistrates or British local rulers, like you can see here, who were considered to have gone native, as other British people would refer to them. They would take local Indian wives, and as you can see here, they dressed as Indian princesses. So this shows how dedicated many British people were into trying to immerse themselves and take advantage of the wealth indirectly, or control wealth in India indirectly by just immersing themselves in the culture and not trying to take everything over. The East India Company also used their economic power to try to take over portions of India, again, somewhat indirectly. Again, going back to their influence through these sepoys, They would take lands from rulers in response to loans and for loans being not paid. They would often coerce many into becoming British wards due to this debt. And this is what led essentially to the rapid shrinking of the Mughal Empire that we talked about a little bit earlier. Up to this point, the Mughal Empire had still been ruling most of India, but as the British started to gain more and more economic control over the region, they were able to take lands from individual rulers as time progressed. This, of course, as you might imagine, led to some of that freedom potentially backfiring against the British. By the 1830s, many British people had called for what they saw as reforms in India. They called for better working conditions, free trade, the end of barbaric local customs, as they called them, and intense missionary work. A couple of specific examples. They established a European tax system which they felt was more efficient, introduced industrial mechanics, transport, and communication. Now, on the surface, these probably all sound like good things, but why do you think maybe the Indians still weren't very fond of them? Again, awkward pause as I wait for an answer that won't come. But yeah, as you can probably guess from this quote right here, most Indians often felt that Europeans were being smug and superior in their control over them. For example, during this time period, as I showed here, there was a historian who worked for the British Parliament named Thomas Macaulay, who once wrote that a single shelf of European books is worth more than all the literatures of Asia and Arabia. So essentially, even though many British felt that they were trying to improve Indian life, that many Indians felt that they were trying to run over them and destroy their local culture. For example, remember, many British called specifically for the end of what they saw as barbaric local customs. So even though this might arguably benefit India by introducing more modern mechanics, many felt that the British were overly influencing them and again, sort of wiping out their culture. This helped lead to India's first War of Independence from 1857 to 1858. Interestingly enough, this revolution was actually caused by a rifle that was produced. The Enfield rifle, which had been produced during the 1850s, required soldiers to bite off the end of a paper cartridge to access the gunpowder. To give you an idea of how that looked, let's look at this next page for a second. As some of you who may know a little bit about military history may be aware, for many of these old rifles, in order to get gunpowder into them, you would carry a gunpowder pouch with you. You would bite off the end and pour the gunpowder directly down the barrel of the gun. This is how many rifles worked at this time. However, there was a rumor throughout to many local Indians that this paper cartridge contained cow and pig fat. Even though this wasn't actually true as it turned out, why would that rumor be such a big deal to the Indian population? And I'll stroke my beard again like a James Bond villain, waiting for an answer. But yeah, for any of you familiar with religious history, this one probably seems pretty straightforward. Remember, most of the population, as we talked about in India at this time, is either Muslim or Hindu. Both Hindu and Muslims religions have certain restrictions against taking in any cow or pig meat or fat or whatever it might be. So many people felt that this was a direct attempt to violate their religious laws and religious practices and make them open to some of that missionary work to convert them to Christianity. This led to a large-scale rebellion that, while unsuccessful, was only put down due to occupations of entire towns and cities and mass executions all across India. So, one thing I'd like you to think about for future assignments potentially is whether or not this Indian rebellion was justified. Is it similar in any way, for example, to our American Revolution? Many of us would obviously believe that our revolution was justified. Was this one justified? Think about that for future assignments. In the meantime, we'll talk about India, of course, in the coming weeks, but for now we're going to look at Australia. Australia was initially colonized by a guy named James Cook, who lived from 1728 to 1779. He arrived on the east coast of Australia in 1770 and immediately claimed the whole place for Great Britain. He planned for this place to be a new convict colony after the American Revolution. Why is that maybe important to remember? All right, very good imaginary class once again. It shows more of the impact of the American Revolution upon world history. For those of you who remember, I believe we mentioned it very briefly earlier in the course. The Georgia colony in America was originally founded to be a penal colony for the British Empire. Now that America is free, the British need to start looking for a new penal colony. So, once the American Revolution was over, they decided that they'd put their convicts in Australia instead. So, between 1788 and 1840, about 50,000 British convicts were shipped to the Australian colony. Almost immediately, Australia did serve to be a big economic boom for the British Empire. There was an agricultural boom in southern Australia specifically due to this reliable rainfall, as well as increased sugar and rice production in the northeast of the country. Sheep ranching and wool exports in the eastern portion of Australia were very profitable as well, and by 1851 there were gold and silver mines established in the country, which actually encouraged more immigration waves not only from Great Britain, but from China as well, which is why I believe to this day there's still a significant Chinese-Australian population descended from some of these immigrants. Now, we of course can't talk about colonization without looking at the impact on the local populations like we did with India. One thing that's particularly interesting about British colonization, while also depressing obviously, is the fact that the British and native Australians had arguably the least in common between a colonizing and indigenous group in any international encounter in history. Why do you think that's the case? Think about what Australia is like. This is a bit of a geography question. Yes, that probably gave it away for a lot of you. Think about what Australia looks like in a world map, for example. Our Australia is one of the most, if not the most, isolated large land masses in the entire world. Because of how isolated Australia was from every other continent on Earth, up to this point it had not really had any direct contact with any other major world power. Because of this, the Aboriginals were very confused and had many varying beliefs on what these English people actually were and what the outside world was like. Historians have found and sociologists have found a few examples of how the Aboriginals tried to explain English arrival. Many of them thought that because of their white skin, that they were actually the ghosts of their dead ancestors. Because like many other religious and traditional beliefs across the world, they have had placed a great emphasis on dead ancestors. They also believed that the rider and a horse that they saw were often one creature. Why might that be the case? This is a little bit of an Australia biology question. Alright, so again, for those of you who know a little bit about what happens to an isolated area biologically, Australia also had a very unique nature and environments. Many animals existed in this area, like kangaroos, that exist nowhere else in the world, but Australia also didn't have any horses at this point before European arrival. So many of them had never encountered a horse, if not all of them, so they didn't know how to separate these new arrivals from the horses. Lastly, many of them also believed that the domesticated animals might actually be the wives of some of these British colonists. Because again, they hadn't seen horses before. So this just shows how great the divide was between these local peoples and British colonists. Now, in sort of less interesting and more depressing, as you might imagine, this contact also led to a huge decline in the Aboriginal population in Australia. The Aboriginals did attempt to fight against British incursions, but they were ultimately unsuccessful for a few reasons. Because of their isolation, partially, most Aboriginal population groups were quite small. It was very difficult for them to form a massive resistance. Also, as a result of this, they had no central organization. The British Empire, of course, was massive and could draw on troops and resources from all across the world. Up till this point, due to their isolation, the Aboriginals had really had no cause to form any mass unity to fight off invaders, so it was very difficult for them to band together. Because of this as well, they had no real forts or visible defenses, so they had essentially no way to protect themselves against the British Army. Now, looking at this again and comparing it to other colonizations we've discussed, what do you think was probably the worst thing the Aborigines actually encountered? Was it British weapons? No, very not. Absolutely. Very, very similar to what happened in the Americas and in Africa. The smallpox and malaria and diseases like that were, of course, had the worst impact on Aborigines because, even more so than Native Americans, they had been very isolated from other world diseases, so they had no immunity. Because of this, there was a huge decline in the Aboriginal population. It is estimated that there was about 250,000 Aborigines living across Australia at the time of that initial contact in 1770. By 1920, the population had gone down to about 16,000 or 60,000. So basically, almost 200,000 died at least after the point of contact. So again, shows the devastating impacts of this initial colonization. Next, we'll look, like I said, we'll look at Africa a bit and what the scramble for Africa was like. Before the infamous scramble for Africa occurred, the British came up with this new international concept called the Concert of Europe. According to this idea, the British and other European countries would maintain a balance of power after the attempted dominance of Napoleon. They didn't want anyone like Napoleon to rise again, so they would try to make sure that all these empires had somewhat equal power so they couldn't dominate each other. This was mainly used as an alliance against the Russian Empire to keep them from controlling portions of the Ottoman Empire and bringing countries back into Asia. A couple of examples of this. By 1847, the French had conquered Algeria and removed the local leaders. The British had also conducted the Great Game, which was their attempt to limit Russian ambitions in Central Asia, as you can see here. By 1838, Afghanistan had been largely overrun and was established as a buffer state between Russia and India. That way, the Russians could not get at the Indian Empire, or the British Empire in India. Between 1853 and 1856, France and Britain defeated Russia in the Crimean War. Now, why would these old enemies be willing to team up, do you think? Alright, this is essentially looking ahead a little bit, as you might have guessed, to further future imperial conflicts. Once one country starts becoming as seemingly overly powerful and is having too much of an empire, many of these other countries will band together to try to limit their growth. Keep that in mind. That's a very important development for future history we're going to talk about. By 1882, however, the British had taken advantage of a revolt against their economic involvement in the country to set up an official colony in Egypt. As you might guess, the British, it could be argued, were actually not super concerned with actual balance, and were essentially have been argued to have used this concert of Europe to protect their own interests. However, in the meantime, as a result of this concert of Europe, the Berlin Conference was formed. This conference was held from 1884 to 1885 by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, as you can see here. He invited 14 European nations and the United States to discuss how they would conduct the colonization in Africa. His main condition was that there would be effective occupation among various spheres of influence. Now again, why would you maybe want these various spheres of influence? Pause for the audience. But yes, very good, imaginary class. This goes back again to this concert of Europe and maintaining a balance of power. If one country tries to take over too much of Africa, their empire might become more powerful than everyone else's and dominate a huge portion of the world. The idea was that every country would get to improve their empire and improve their economy, but none of them would be able to dominate the other, again, like Napoleon tried to do. This led to many people like David Livingstone, who popularized the civilizing mission. He was one of the initial explorers and missionaries into Africa who argued that that Europeans should preach Christianity and commerce to Africa. So essentially, we should lift them out of spiritual darkness as well as lifting them out of economic darkness and ignorance. He was initially limited by yellow fever and malaria in the interior of Africa, but with improving medical conditions and increased immunity, was able to get into the interior by the 1850s. Now, this of course did occur a little bit before the actual conference of the Berlin Conference, but why was this philosophy later be used to justify colonization? I really don't know where to look during these pauses. But yes, it goes back to one of the oldest motivations for colonization, the whole God, gold, and glory idea. If you can argue that you're bringing Christianity and civilization to Africa, it justifies you taking everything over because you would still believe or still argue to people that you're actually improving the lives of Africans by bringing them civilization, essentially. However, the problems of this philosophy are something you can see again just in this conference in Africa, or this Berlin conference. No African nations were invited to this conference. So instead of trying to include African perspectives and African goals and desires, these countries essentially feel so superior that they're going to cut up Africa like a cake, as you can see in this picture, and decide the fate of entire nations and groups of people without consulting any actual African opinions. This led, of course, to great conquests across all of Africa. By 1914, Africa had been split up into essentially this map you can see right here. For example, by 96, the British nation or Proctorate of Ghana had been established after the Ashanti Kingdom was defeated. By 1891, the French had established a colony in West Africa, which you can see here, after they defeated an Islamic reformer. By 1886, the Germans had established the colony of East Africa, which you can see down here. 1885, the Belgians established a colony in Central Africa, the Belgian Congo. And by 1885, the Spanish had established a colony in Rio de Oro in Northwest Africa, which you can see a tiny sliver of right here. Now, again, this whole civilizing mission and era of superiority led to many horrible atrocities across all of Africa. For example, between 1905 and 1907, there was a Maji-Maji rebellion against German labor conditions, the ethnic group at the time. The labor conditions were quite harsh in East Africa, so they attempted to revolt. The Germans responded by killing roughly 200,000 people, or about 1/3 of the population of this ethnic group. Between 1904 and 1907, the Hirio Anama uprising also occurred in East Africa. This time, up to about 150,000 were killed. So potentially almost 400,000 were killed just in this 2 to 3 year time span with local rebellions. The Congo was not much better. After the Belgians took over the Belgian Congo, they set up many forced labor camps for rubber production. Beatings and mutilations were administered if the production quotas weren't filled. So, for example, as you can see here, cutting off the arms or hands of African children and African workers was a common punishment for not fulfilling these quotas. During the entire existence of the Belgian Congo, it is argued that potentially up to 10 million African workers were killed or starved to death as a result of the brutal working conditions and the beatings and mutilations. So again, this wasn't exactly, as you can see here, a really civilizing mission. Finally, let's look at a few global consequences of imperialism to tie this into the larger world. By the end of the colonization of Africa, France and Great Britain had united to slow the growing imperial power of Germany specifically. Again, they would probably do this to limit the growth of the German Empire. When one empire seems to be getting too powerful, countries are going to start uniting, even though they had previously been enemies against each other. By 1904, these countries had formed the Entente Cordiale. This was a specific agreement where the British agreed to support France in beating the Germans for control of Morocco and Northwest Africa, leading to a long-standing alliance. Now, looking ahead a little bit again, why might these alliances have consequences, or what might be some of the consequences for these international alliances? To answer this, think specifically to how Germany is going to respond. Are they just going to sit there twiddling their thumbs, or might they potentially form other alliances as well? Think about how that's going to affect world history in the coming decade. In the meantime, that's all I have for you today. Just again, very briefly, remember these upcoming assignments. If you have any questions about them, please let me know. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week.